evening. Welcome to this first installment of this academic year's Dominican Forum. This is a wonderful opportunity for all of us, not only to begin the Dominican Forum with speaking about this amazing progress we've made, and we at Holy Rosary know this, amazing progress. It's easier to do progress at Holy Rosary, right? Progress in the liturgical movement that continues to happen. And the liturgical movement happens because of a dialogue between rites, because of all the amazing things that Pope Benedict opened our liturgical life up to, and the direction that we can go in understanding the better ways that we can worship the Lord. And so we have this almost a joint effort, I think, between Holy Rosary and the Cantores and Ecclesia here to begin their William Byrd Festival. And we have welcomed these most esteemed guests to Holy Rosary to offer a solemn high mass according to the use of the ordinariates approved by Apostolic See in 2013. And we might say, and Father Carl, the speaker tonight, can speak more clearly to some of that, some of the language that we should employ, but for simply the Anglican use of the Roman Rite. We welcome three, usually we just introduce one person, but we welcome three priests who will offer the Mass tomorrow. One is celebrant, the Reverend Monsignor Peter Wilkinson will be the celebrant, as maybe Father Carl could say some more about each one of them. With all that running around, I didn't have a chance to grab the biographies, so I apologize for that. But maybe that's appropriate to let you tell your own stories in a way. And then the deacon tomorrow will be our speaker, the Reverend Reid. And somewhere here, the subdeacon for tomorrow is the Reverend Michael Birch. Oh, there you are. Yes, perspective here. So again, we not only acknowledge this first, and August is such a wonderful month here, this first of the many diverse rites we'll offer during this month. In the next 2 weeks, we'll offer really 4 different forms / rites of the Latin Church, with the Anglican, the Ordinary Roman, the Extraordinary Roman, when Bishop Meeking comes, and of course the Dominican Rite on the Feast of St. Dominic this Sunday. All of these participate in bringing to light, the way to worship God. As a friend of ours, a dear friend of many of ours, Father Decker, Abuna, as he terms himself, he says no one rite can fully articulate the praise of God. We need all of those rites together. I also want to point, please, tomorrow you'll receive the pamphlet for following the worship. On the back is the schedule for the William Byrd Festival with its concerts and liturgy. And please participate in some of those if you're able, as many as possible, to support then sacred arts and this wonderful way to worship the Lord. Portland, of all places, has such a deep liturgical tradition, and that it needs our support to make that happen. So again, I'd like to welcome here our speaker, the Reverend Michael Birch. The Reverend Reid. I had you two mixed up before. I'm sorry. I don't know why I thought that Father Michael would be speaking, but Father Carl will be speaking. He's trying to insult me now.
I didn't prepare any notes other than bring a little book, which I can highly recommend to you if you're interested in learning more about specifically the Ordinariate in England. It's written by Father Abe Nichols. Some of you may know of him. His best-known book is The Panther and the Hind, about Anglicanism. He was an Anglican until age 17. He's now 72, something like that. This is called Catholics of the Anglican Patrimony, the Personal Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, which is the name of the ordinariate in England. And more importantly, he's a Dominican. Now, I didn't prepare any written notes other than I'm going to read a couple of quotes from this because I don't know my audience. So I'm going to ask you some questions. First question. Who's going to win the Super Bowl? Oh, sorry. How many can tell me? Can anyone tell me what the date was of Anglicanism Cedibus, which is part of the title of the talk, the gift of Pope Benedict XVI to the Church. When was that promulgated?
2008.
You're close, but about a year off.
Council of Trent.
2009, Council of Trent, yes, 2009. So we're coming up on the 5th anniversary at the end of October since he issued that wonderful Apostolic Constitution. Second question, how many can tell me what Anglicanism Cedibus stands for or translates as?
To the communities of Anglicans.
Well, of Anglicans is easy.
Of
Anglican plural. Cedibus. Cedibus is a difficult word. Doesn't translate easily.
Gangs.
Sorry?
Gangs.
Gangs of Anglicans. I like that. The initial attempt was the gathering of Anglicans. This was probably the best, really. So the next question then becomes, how much does any of you know about the history of Anglicanism? Some. Those of you that put your hands up, do you know what sort of first-faceted personality Anglicanism has had, not just in the last 5 decades, but since 1534? So it has always encompassed a very broad extreme of churchmanship, understanding of the faith, and everything in between. So there have always been what you want to call them at one end Anglo-Papalists, Anglo-Catholics, at the other end extreme Protestants. So if you were to ask the average Anglican throughout that entire 460-year history, it's more than that now, isn't it? Gosh. Almost 500-year history, are you a Catholic? Are you a Protestant? You would get a different answer from almost every Anglican. Anglicans themselves, to a large extent, have trouble pinning themselves to the wall. Now, we tend to be the late 20th, early 21st century version of what were Anglo-Papalists or Anglo-Catholics until we were received into the Catholic Church. Father Nichols talks about what he describes as 3 primary types of Anglicans. And he refers to extreme Protestants, the Anglo-Catholics, and in the middle he refers to latitudinarians, which within Anglicanism we call broad church, which is to say, well, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody, and they would sort of go with the flow. There has always been that desire since 1534 to heal the wound. It's not something recent. It doesn't just go back to 2009. It doesn't just go back to Pope Paul VI meeting with Michael Ramsey in the mid-1960s. It doesn't just go back to the Mailings conversations in the 1920s and 30s. It goes right back, of course, dealing with Henry and, of course, his son, and then Mary and Elizabeth, that King James I really truly wanted the Church of England to be returned to full communion with the Catholic Church, but he knew that he didn't have the support of Parliament or the majority of the people in England. Charles I, the same. There is a steady thread throughout history. Then the Oxford movement, Cardinal Newman, they all wished the restoration of that broken unity. Now maybe if I give you some modern context, personal journey. In 1974, do any of you recall what happened in Philadelphia within the Episcopal Church of the United States?
They ordained women priests.
Well, they purported to ordain women priests because it wasn't for another 2 years at General Convention that they democratically voted to change God's mind. If that's possible. And that happened at the same time in Canada in 1976. A synod in Canada decided to, some people use the term, invent priestesses, however you want to describe it. In September of 1977, so 37 years ago, a congress was called in St. Louis of concerned Anglicans. And 2,000 people showed up, most of them lay people, a few priests. I was one of the lay people. I am that old. And Monsignor Wilkinson, Father Peter Wilkinson at the time, was one of the priests. There were 6 of us from Victoria and Vancouver that went to St. Louis. And it was realized that although Anglicanism had gone through several dips before, they typically pulled back from the edge in terms of doing something drastic with respect to the sacraments, at least so far as the High Church Anglicans understood it. But at this point we realized they've reached a point that there's probably not going to be any turning back. So immediately after the Congress of St. Louis, something started called continuing Anglicanism. And we separated ourselves from the Canterbury Communion, at least in North America. We claimed still to be in communion with Canterbury itself, but not with ECUSA and the Anglican Church of Canada, because they had compromised the understanding of the nature of the sacrament. And it wasn't just the ordination of women, it was also the marriage canon. It didn't get any publicity. All the publicity was about the ordination or not of women. So Father Peter started a little parish in what was the first continuing Anglican parish in Canada, in Victoria. And things went on. And there were clauses in something called the Affirmation of St. Louis that quite clearly articulated our desire to restore that broken unity. One of the other people from Victoria that came with us was Father Robert Crawley, and he'd been in the RAF. He's a Brit, and he described us as a small aircraft that had taken off and was looking for a landing place. Others drew what I think is a better analogy. We had jumped off the Canterbury catamaran into a lifeboat and were looking for the mothership. To be quite honest, speaking personally, I didn't know whether the articulated clauses in the affirmation that said we want to restore the broken unity referred to the Catholic Church or perhaps Orthodoxy. But it became pretty clear fairly quickly that Orthodoxy was not really an option. So the focus became to look towards Rome, because after all, the Church of England was originally part of the Latin Church. Fast forward 15 years to 1992. We had increased our presence to 14 countries around the world. Initially, we were Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. But as other countries fell off the boat, as it were, groups would join us in those countries. And it was in 1992 also that the Church of England itself, who 15 years earlier had told us it's never going to happen in England, they voted themselves to begin to ordain women. So we had a meeting in Victoria, actually, of members from the 14 countries and gathered together in a body called the Traditional Anglican Communion with its membership bodies from around the world. A year later, after England had voted, Canterbury itself, the Vatican called us and said, "Want to have a talk?" And we said, "Be right there." So off went some representatives, and they met with Bishop Dupre at the time, the Congregation for Christian Unity, I believe. And Cardinal Dupre was an interesting choice for the Vatican spokesman, or I should say negotiator in terms of meeting with us, because in the Second World War he had served in North Africa interfacing with Muslims. So he'd obviously had some practice in dealing with difficult people. Wonderful talks, and he asked us to go and do 3 things. One was to crow, to prove that the Spirit is moving you in the proper direction. where appropriate, to make good relationships with the local Catholic diocese, which here in North America happened largely through the pro-life movement. And thirdly, to not unnecessarily increase the episcopacy, which we did do outside of the United States. Sadly, in the United States, continuing Anglicanism had already begun to fragment into more and more and more groups. At one point, there were 52 different continuing Anglican bodies in the United States. There was one in Canada. There was one in Australia, et cetera, et cetera. So we went away in 1993. We started to grow. In 2000, fast forward again another 15 years, 2007, 14 years, our former bishop in Canada, who had been, he was a white African, Robert Mercer, born in Zimbabwe, a monk of the Community of the Resurrection in Yorkshire. And when he had retired from Matabele land to make way for a native African bishop, he went back to the mother house in Murfield and wondered what he was going to do until we called him and said, "Why don't you come to Canada?" So he did come to Canada in 1989 to become our third diocesan bishop in the Anglican Catholic Church of Canada. And boy, did he hate winters, because when you're from Zimbabwe, yes. So, at any rate, Bishop Mercer served us for 15 years in Canada until he turned 70 in 2005. Then in early 2007, he was celebrating the 30th anniversary of his ordination as an Anglican bishop. And several of the bishops from around the world, by this time, Monsignor Wilkinson was our Canadian bishop. I was one of his suffragans or auxiliary bishops. Central Canada was my little territory from Montreal to the end of Lake Superior, which is 2,000 miles. And we decided, let's go celebrate the 30th anniversary of Robert Mercer's consecration, episcopal ordination. So we did, went to Portsmouth, where he served in a church there. And then afterwards, we trundled off up to Lincoln, where one of our parishes had bought an old monastery, prior of St. Catherine. And they received a couple of £1 million from the National Trust in England to restore it to its former beauty, which was pretty handy. And I think there were 8 of our bishops from around the world there helping Bishop Mercer celebrate his anniversary. And so we sat down and we took about a full day to put together a 1.5-page letter to now Pope Benedict, pointing out in 1993 we met with Bishop Dupre. You asked him to do this, we've done that. Is it time for us to meet again? By the way, we're having our College of Bishops meeting in England in October. This is 2007. He sent that letter to the CDF, not to the Congregation for Christian Unity, but to the CDF itself. And a note came back saying, yes, please, when you finish your College of Bishops meeting, come to see us. So at our College of Bishops meeting, we put together a much longer petition requesting full communion in the Catholic Church with no conditions on our part, simply asking, what do we need to do? And then, how many bishops were we? 30-ish in Portsmouth. After the celebration of Mass on the feast of Saint Thérèse Lisieux, we all solemnly signed a copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church on the altar, and it was taken to Rome by Bishop Wilkinson, Bishop Mercer, and Archbishop Hepworth, our primate from Australia. They met in the CDF with Bishop Denoya, OP. And he apparently ran over to the Pope afterwards and handed him the copy of the signed catechism. Now, it might sound like, up to this point, we were the only ones doing anything, but that's not true. After the vote in England in 1992, a group started in England called Forward in Faith. And they too began to wonder, what are we going to do if Canterbury falls completely off the rails and starts to make women bishops? Which, of course, if you've been following the news, they just voted to do within the last couple of weeks. Both at our 30th 30th anniversary celebration for Bishop Mercer and our Portsmouth College of Bishop meeting 6 months later, one John Broadhurst, a Church of England bishop, forward in faith, was with us. And we shared everything with him quite openly. And he didn't share everything with us quite so openly, because in March of 2008, the Forward in Faith bishops met with representatives from the Vatican, I think Cardinal Schönberg in Austria. OP. Detecting a theme here. At the same time, in the United States, the Episcopal Diocese of Fort Worth began to make very serious overtures towards the Holy See themselves. And today, ground zero for us at CDF is Monsignor Stephen Lopes from San Francisco. And at our annual clergy retreat last summer, he told us that the two things that encouraged Pope Benedict to promulgate the Apostolic Constitution so quickly, because our delivery of Catechism was 2007, and exactly 2 years later, an Apostolic Constitution, that's light speed for a church to do something like that. Monsignor Lopes said that the two things that convinced the Pope to promulgate the Apostolic Constitution was a signed copy of the Catechism by the TAC bishops and a petition from the Diocese of Fort Worth in Texas. And voila, 2 years later, the Apostolic Constitution was issued. Now, it wasn't smooth sailing from that point on either side of the fence. In some countries, the Episcopal delegates didn't really know all that much about who we were, whether we were TAC, Forward in Faith, or Diocese of Fort Worth people, how to deal with us. They didn't understand the paradigm, the model of a typical Anglican parish. Anglicans, generally speaking, are a little bit better at tithing than Catholics. So how can a parish with 80 people be self-sustaining? Because, of course, I've just moved to Victoria, back to Victoria from Ottawa. And in Ottawa, they've been closing down Catholic parishes when they drop below 400 or 500 people because they can't support themselves financially. Well, we do that quite handily with 60 or 70 people. So it's, even now, 5 years later, we're still having trouble defining what's a parish and what's not, whether it's just a community of the faith or a quasi-parish or a parish. Within our own communities, things were very rocky. We thought, of course, silly us, that all Anglo-Catholics felt the same way that we do. But Father Nichols pointed something out that I've always known. And I don't know why I didn't realize it in my own parishes back in Ontario and Quebec. And that's that many, many high church Anglican parishes, Anglo-Catholic parishes, call them what you will, didn't really have much substance underneath the veneer of incense and somptuous bells. And the phrase that Father Nichols uses is that in the modern Anglo-Catholic paradigm, things are liturgically decorous, but doctrinally debilitated. So within our own communities, people that had themselves left the Anglican Church of Canada or ACUSA in the United States and had come to us, and we had told them, you know, it is our purpose to become reunited with the Church of Rome, to heal that wound. And of course, many of them had come to us for a variety of reasons. They didn't want to lose their precious Book of Common Prayer with his wonderful Tudor English, which, by the way, we haven't lost. You'll find that out tomorrow if you're coming to Mass. Or same-sex marriage, let me out of there. Or whatever other reasons. And I would look at them straight in the eyes and say, you know, we're going to become part of the Catholic Church. And they'd look at me and look straight through me, and I could see them saying in their minds, but not in my lifetime. And to be quite honest, going back 37 years, when I went to St. Louis, I didn't think anything would happen in my lifetime. I thought we simply would be planting seeds, and that it might happen, hopefully, prayerfully, in a future generation, through some of the work that we had done. That it has happened, praise God. So things began to split. First, when the Apostolic Constitution was issued, some people didn't even read it. They just left. Others read it and said, well, when do I get to tell Benedict what should be in here? Others who tried to bring them along, and they'd stumble on things like the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary and whatever else. And even in my own case, going back 37 years ago, by the way, I'm a professional engineer before I was ordained as a priest. So I bring that kind of logic to the faith, and I'm glad I did. And I'm also glad that I actually had a lapse period when I was in university studying engineering. Because prior to that, in the Anglican Church of Canada, I was at the forefront of all kinds of cool things, like I'm also a musician, so I wrote some folk masses, and I was pushing things very far liturgically left. So I left, and then I had my own road to Damascus experience, or a reversion as it's now called today, and went back to the Anglican Church after shopping around, and was about to discover that things were changing quite dramatically, and said, no, this is all wrong. And then as I spent more time studying, because I had the great thirst, I began to realize, well, the Immaculate Conception, logically, is demanded by Scripture. The bodily assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary is logically demanded by Scripture. I had a tough time because not everybody has an engineer's brain, convincing those people that like to see things in multi shades of gray rather than black and white, how those things were logically demanded by Scripture. And so they too left. So those of us that have come into the Catholic Church are somewhat reduced in number, but we are so thankful. Some that didn't come with us have turned around and joined us and found, wow, this is wonderful. The bickering is all gone. And let me tell you, there was some pretty serious bickering. There were always people biting at your heels. They didn't understand that the Anglican model of how a parish is run is pretty darn close to the proper Catholic model, which is to say there is one liturgical officer in a parish, period, and so on and so on. So we are here today, and we have the utmost respect for Pope Francis. We think he's providing yet another version of what Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict have brought to the world in terms of the Catholic Church, which is to say, the world is discovering that the Catholic Church is not all that evil. They really do believe in corporal works of mercy and all these other things, and they practice them. But we tend to refer to ourselves as Benedict men because he issued the Apostolic Constitution. We will be eternally grateful to him for doing so. Now, I hope I didn't bore you to tears with all that. I think probably I should throw the floor open to questions. And if I can't answer them, we have two more here that will. Oh, by the way, I kind of gave you the background of my own track, which was engineering before I became ordained as an Anglican priest in 1990, bishop 2007, Catholic priest January, what year are we in now? 2013. And Monsignor Wilkinson, like Robert Mercer, the aforementioned Zimbabwe bishop, is a Murfield grad in England. He was ordained a priest by Archbishop Michael Ramsey, who had met with Pope Paul VI in the mid-60s. And Pope Paul made a couple of phrases that really indicated that he was serious about bringing the sister church, is what he referred to the Anglican Church as, back into full communion. He took his episcopal ring off and put it on Michael Ramsey's hand. Gestures like that. So Father Peter was ordained by Michael Ramsey. Father Michael, when were you ordained an Anglican priest, Father?
May 71.
1971. You're older than I am.
In Victoria.
Victoria. Catholic Church in
2003.
2003. And in Calgary, and prior to that, he'd been serving in a parish in Calgary, St. John the Evangelist, which is now our flagship parish in Canada. And it came directly into the Ordinariate from the Anglican Church of Canada. It was not part of our continuing Anglican body in Canada. It stayed in the Anglican Catholic Church. And our Canadian dean, Lee Kenyon, serves now at St. John the Evangelist. And the membership of that parish has almost tripled in the 2.5 years since it came into the Catholic Church. And then Father Michael, when he turned 65 9 years ago, 63?
When I turned 63.
63.
I said, that's it.
Oh, but yes, but then a few years later, when he turned 65, he retired to Victoria.
66, I was when I retired.
Okay. Retired to Victoria, where he's only saying Mass in Catholic churches about 17 times a week. So there's a shortage of priests in the Diocese of Victoria. So there are 4 of us in a very small community in Victoria. But overall, we probably say more Novus Ordo or extraordinary form Masses than we do our ordinary Mass. So we're helping out in the diocese, even though we're not officially members of the diocese. Each of us has faculties within the diocese. So that's who we are. Do you have any questions? Yes?
I was wondering, Pope Francis, what is his connection with your movement or whatever you call it?
Good question, because within the week of his becoming Pope, somebody dug up an old quote of his that he had given to one Gregory Venables, who's an Anglican bishop of something called the Southern Cone, which is to say the Southern Hemisphere. And the quote seemed to suggest that there was no need for such a thing. But that quote is apparently decades old. In actual fact, since Pope Francis has become the Pope, he has broadened the nature of the eligibility for membership in the Ordinariate. So originally it was that you or your wife or your children must have an Anglican connection, or you cannot become a member of the Ordinariate. They didn't want us stealing members from local Latin Mass parishes. Now, it's if anybody was baptized as a Catholic but lapsed, and they come back to the church through our own evangelical work and are reconciled within the Ordinariate, they can become members, even though they have no Anglican connection previously. If they were Methodists. So Pope Francis has broadened that. So we're okay with him. Yes?
If you're not incarnated under the local bishop, who's your ordinary?
Our ordinary is one Monsignor Jeffrey Steenson. He himself, a former Anglican, grew up on a farm in North Dakota. A splendid choice for the ordinary because we are a pan-geographical ordinariate in North America. It's the United States and Canada. So he's our ordinary for us in Canada. And from that little farm in North Dakota, the nearest big city was Winnipeg, Manitoba. So he spent a lot of time in Winnipeg and began to understand a little bit about hockey. So he's really quite an ideal choice for all of North America. He himself became an Episcopal bishop in 2007, but 2 years later, 2009, before the Apostolic Constitution was issued, he entered the Catholic Church under the pastoral provision. Have you all heard about the pastoral provision? 1980, Pope John Paul II issued something just for the continental United States, where individuals could join the Catholic Church from the Episcopal Church. And that's how Monsignor Steenson came into the Catholic Church. So, yes?
Father, I can never understand the attitude of certain people that are obviously so Catholic. For example, C.S. Lewis, whose brother became a Catholic, living with him. He couldn't do it. Yaroslav Pelikan, who was a Lutheran, was totally Catholic. And yet, they simply could not give themselves to Rome. And I was wondering what you can say about that attitude. Was it nationalist prejudice, or was it liturgy, or what was it, you suppose?
I can only comment a little bit about C.S. Lewis. I don't recall, but I think it's at the beginning of Mere Christianity, where he states that although I am a member of the Church of England, I tend to look at myself in a pan-denominational way, because he found the fractured nature of Christianity to be a tragedy. I don't know whether that's anything that prevented him from becoming Catholic, but I'm sure Monsignor Wilkinson can add more to that.
C.S. Lewis is a hero of mine. Believe it or not,
Louder, please.
believe it or not, C.S. Lewis was an Irishman. He came from Northern Ireland. And if you know anything about Northern Ireland, you know that Catholics and Protestants hate one another. Or things are getting better. But it was a tough time. Anti-Catholicism, if you were English, was in your blood. And it actually took Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, who was his good friend, to deal with his anti-Catholic prejudice. And in 1939, at the beginning of the war, in one of his letters, which no one ever quotes, he said, one of the things that will convince the world that the Pope is who he is, that he is seen to be the leader of Christendom. Well, who else is the leader of Christendom except the Holy Father? And has been forever. But lately, who speaks for Christians? You know? And that was Lewis's comment about that. Lewis also, he was an Anglo-Catholic. He made his confession regularly. He had a spiritual director who was a Catholic father. And he also was a spiritual director to a Catholic saint. There is a volume called The Latin Letters of C.S. Lewis. And there was an Italian friar, Don Giovanni, who wrote Lewis a fan letter because he'd read the Screwtape letters and he wanted to know more. And not knowing any English, he wrote to C.S. Lewis in Latin. And Lewis replied in Latin saying that his Italian was not good enough, but could they correspond in Latin? So they did. And you can read this small book, and you find Don Giovanni asking Lewis for spiritual advice. And Lewis is saying, well, I'm only a layman and you're a Catholic priest, but this is what I think. And they continued this correspondence over quite a few years. Don Giovanni died. He was subsequently beatified and then canonized. Lewis continued corresponding with the prior of the monastery where Don Giovanni lived. And gradually, Lewis got ill and died. But there is this wonderful connection between Lewis calling Don Giovanni his spiritual father and Don Giovanni getting spiritual advice from C.S. Lewis. So it was good. And I think C.S. Lewis himself is a great evangelizer of Catholics. You know, I did read somewhere that the man that began Ave Maria University, Domino, one of his converting influences was Mere Christianity. And if this is true, then I've got to do something about it. So he divvied up his funds and did good works with them. And I mean, he's quoted by evangelicals and Catholics. I mean, he seems to be everybody's sort of primary evangelizer. The first theological book I ever read was The Problem in Pain. So I think he'd have been on board. I really do. And there's actually a book about, I think it's called C.S. Lewis in the Church of Rome. And those who knew him knew that he wouldn't put up with nonsense such as you get in the Church of England at all. And while I'm here, can I say thank you to the Dominican first of all, of Father Benedict, have been a great influence on this movement. Father Aiden, in the 1990s, was greatly disturbed at the ordination of women to the priesthood in the Church of England, and about 500 or 600 Anglican priests left the Church of England and became Catholics. They didn't have a very good time because the Catholic Church was not yet ready for this deluge of men. And Father Eden was pretty certain that Anglicans should be a right, not a use. That is, that they should have their own episcopate. He wanted to keep them out of the clutches, as he said, of national bishops. And his book, The Pantheon and the Hive, is a complete deconstruction of Anglicanism. You should read it. It's also quite funny. And he recognizes great Anglican theologians as crypto-Catholics and quotes them often. He's also written a complete homiliary, book of short homilies, on the whole of the modern right. And if you haven't read it, if you haven't seen this, the Sanctuary Cycle is pretty heavy on Dominicans, as you might expect, because he's the prior of St. Michael's Priory in Cambridge. He was also the first Roman Catholic to lecture at the University of Oxford, because he had a John Paul II lectureship of Catholic theology. And he told me that he much prefers to do the garden, write, and look after the cat. But instead, he's not just been made a prior, and says, well, that means finances. But this is a 4-volume set, plus what Andrew does. But for every day of the year, there is at least one short homily, and of course one for ABC as well. So there's everything there. And yet he's the most prolific Catholic writer that there is at the moment. He must have 40 books to his credit, including standard texts that we all read. So he's been a great booster of ours. And when Anglican Generals came out, he was lobbying Dominicans who were consultants to the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. Vote for a right, don't vote for a use. And he didn't get his way. But we did get our own ordinariates. So we are friends with local Catholic bishop, who local Catholic Church gives us work. But it's a good compromise. It's a good compromise. And then the other thing is, when we took the letter to CEF, the first person that entered the boardroom at CEF was none other than Augustine de Noia, who would be in full Dominican faith, full habit, busting in. Yes, this is what and he was very, very good to us. He read the letter through as quickly as possible, put it down, and said, well, what took you so long? He said, well, we have to work it out ourselves. He said, fine. Now, the church has never done this before, taking in so many people. He said, we have to get it right the first time. It'll take a while. Be patient. And he took, actually what happened with that catechism was that Cardinal Vega took it across to the Pope in the afternoon, and the Pope signed it, tears running down his cheeks. It's in the archives at CEF. My further contact with Archbishop de Noia is that he went to that CBF and went to worship and sacraments, and I had a letter from him asking me to participate in the group called Anglican Use, which the group that is forming the Anglican liturgy. The first part has been done. It's called Divine Worship Occasional Offices, and then the second part is the missal, for which I provided texts along with the other one. And that is going to be unveiled in Houston at our principal church, which is Our Lady of Washington, on February the 1st. And Carl Reid is going to be there. And Father Lewis, who's been our shield defender, the great priest of the Archdiocese of San Francisco. Those are all Dominican reminiscences and great kindness that the Dominicans have shown us. So thank you, fathers and brothers. It's been, you've been very, very kind to us. And this is just another example. Thank you.
Monsignor Wilkinson, in some of his comments, reminded me of something that in the concluding 2 pages of Father Nichols' book about the ordinary in England, he provides 2 quotations from one of his brother Dominicans. I don't know if he actually knew him, because this gentleman was born in he was ordained an Anglican in 1915, and served in the Great War in the mud of Passchendaele, and came back to England and entered the Winning Order after, as I say, he'd been an Anglican priest. And he's answering the question of, if you meet us on the street or in a church service, is there some way that I can still tell whether you were once an Anglican or not? And in 1964, this other Dominican, who had been an Anglican, wrote, few Catholic priests can have had such concentrated Anglican antecedents and background as mine were. Well, perhaps now some can. I can truly say that all the best things in Anglicanism are still in me at every human level. Intuitive, affective, and intellectual, integrated now into my Catholicism. These have been incorporated into my Catholic life, and I'm very sure perfected by it. But the roots of this composite are thoroughly Anglican, and I am deeply grateful for the ethos of the Church of England and its doctrine, which have penetrated and built up the family, parents, and brothers and sisters in which I was bred. There are some other little secrets that will tell you, if we're in a church service with you, that we were once Anglicans, because when the celebrant turns and says, "The Lord be with you," we're going to say, "And with my spirit." But in all seriousness, some of our people have so thoroughly embraced Catholicism, you can't tell that they were anything ever other than that. Others, especially our priests, if you hear them celebrating the ordinary form of Mass, you'll notice something different. And it's because the Tudor English, that if you come to Mass tomorrow evening you'll hear, has a cadence to it that is different than the ordinary form. And somehow we managed to bring that into the ordinary form. So if you're ever at a Mass and you say, "That sounds a little different," you should go ask the priest afterwards if you believe in Anglicans.
You mentioned saying the ordinary form and the extraordinary form up in Canada. Is the Anglican rite available to Catholic priests of this diocese of the order?
The ordinary, Monsignor Steenson in Houston, can provide faculties to a Catholic priest for doing that, but it's not something that a local Catholic priest would go through the local Catholic bishop and ask for. He should do both, in actual fact. Perhaps the most interesting example is, as we were all being prepared to be brought into the Catholic Church in our groups, Cheticos, we all had mentor priests in our various locations around North America. And in Ottawa is ground zero for something called the Companions of the Cross. Are you familiar with that? A priest in the late 1970s took over a derelict Catholic parish, St. Mary's in Ottawa. And there was a charismatic renewal that happened spontaneously. And out of it, many vocations came. Now, although their worship style initially was charismatic, their theology was always very orthodox. And they have had a flourishing of vocations that has continued at the same time as the charismania, for want of a better word, has sort of toned down a little bit. But Archbishop Prendergast has XJ. He's a good Jesuit. He's actually a very good Jesuit. He appointed one of the companions as our mentor priest, an Irishman, Father Francis Donnelly. And Father Francis fell in love with our Anglican Use Mass. And then he couldn't be there, so he asked the superior, Father Scott McCabe. And he fell in love with it so much so that he officially requested Monsignor Stevenson, our ordinary, if he could celebrate our, it's not supposed to be called Anglican Use Mass, but that's what it is, monthly at the Mother House of the Companions in Ottawa. And he's received approval to do so. So, generally speaking, the answer is no. But there are extraordinary cases where the permission is granted.
You see the Anglican Mass, what would be the correct way to refer to it?
Well, they want us to use the term divine worship, but in the Saturday paper, that's what the Presbyterians say they do on Sunday mornings.
Okay, but do you see that as a solution to the tensions that are in the church now between people who are very attached to the extraordinary form and those who can't see it at all? I mean, is this a viable idea that would work?
In our own experience, we found that it has resonated with people of both camps. Certainly more readily with those who are used to the extraordinary form, because, again, if you come tomorrow evening to say, wow, this is just the extraordinary form in Tudor English, with a few extra Anglican prayers chucked in. But the other aspect of what we do is we do everything so that you can hear it. Okay, so the canon of the Mass is said that you can hear it, whereas in the extraordinary form. So you'll notice a difference happening. But people that are used to the ordinary form, when they come to Mass, something strikes them in terms of the way the service is offered, not just by the priest, but by the faithful in Christ. It truly is a perfect act of worship, which is why anyone should come to church other than to receive the Blessed Sacrament, is to offer a perfect act of worship. And we do that corporately. And you'll hear people singing as one voice, saying the prayers as one voice. That truly is something that strikes people, that when we get around to things that we call clerical access, the general confession, it's not like a Catholic parish where those people over there are 2 lines ahead of those people over there. You hear it as one voice, and that strikes people, and they'll say something afterwards. So whether you call it a via media, I don't know if that's a proper term, but if we can do something, because Benedict did mention about us bringing this into the church to be shared. It's a treasure. He referred to it as a treasured gift. Monsignor is going to provide that quote in his sermon tomorrow. So I encourage you all to come to Mass tomorrow evening, of course. Yes?
Well, canonically, in the Catholic movement, they solved it Sunday obligation now and then.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, we are fully Catholic. And so, yes, Father.
It strikes me that for a lot of majority there, the Anglican Church has served as a sort of way station for non-Anglican Protestants to come to the Church of England and then on that finally slip inside of it. It seems to me that the opening up of for evangelization is a wonderful opportunity not only to evangelize lapsed Catholics, to invite Anglicans who are concerned about the state of their own piece of community, but it seems to me also an evangelization of Protestants where your forms of worship might be less formed and ours might be one thing that might be perfect.
Absolutely, yes, to all those, and add to the list, well, expand something that you mentioned, that perhaps we're less threatened, even though we are now Catholic, people recognize in us someone that was once like them, so I can talk to you. So yes, we've experienced that. And through our time, actually leading up to this, we had quite a few people that came to us from wherever, in the 40,000 Protestant denominations, on their way to Rome. They didn't even wait for us until Anglican was issued. They just kept right on going. Yes?
How close is the Anglican Use Mass to the Book of Common Prayer to Anglicanism? Because I read before that they sort of fragmented. I just wasn't sure.
Some prayers are identical, others are not. Now, it's an interesting thing. What Anglican Traditionis is doing is creating a single book for the entire English-speaking world. And of course, Anglicanism always prided itself on something called the Book of Common Prayer. But the Book of Common Prayer was different in action. So when you ask the question, you say, well, are you referring to the South African prayer book, or the United States, or Canada, or 1662, which was in England and Australia, and so yes, sort of. Yes, Father.
I come from England, but very well Catholic. But there was great joy on the day that Anglican ownership was promulgated. I have to say, if it's naughty joy, because we were quite, some of us were quite happy to see Archbishop Nichols and the Archbishop of Canterbury caught on it completely by surprise. And not a little a tad embarrassed that they had not been let in on this. Benedict had just sort of ran out and afterwards. But it was really tremendous. A lot of us were very joyful to see this way of you guys unusual church. It also, I think, made it possible for you to preserve your traditions. Because a lot of Anglicans who became Catholic rather lamented the poor state of our Catholicism. It was not relevant or anything. So in this way, you're able to provide a bit of that mutual enrichment that's more pontificate, also possible between the extraordinary and the ordinary form of Mass. My question is, though, why is it still that groups of people like forward in faith cannot bring themselves to come into communion with the Catholic Church? Basically, in England anyway, they still look for solutions like flying bishops, now that women bishops will be ordained, and they're still looking for alternative oversight. When will they possibly see the light? Even, the Ordinariate in England is dedicated to Our Lady of Walsingham, but there's no sign of the Anglican shrine of Walsingham, or the priests and the people that are coming into communion with the Catholic Church.
I could be cheeky and say English imperialism. But to be quite honest, we don't really know why. We certainly experienced that in all of our communities here in North America, with those that didn't join, and the significant numbers that we had always assumed were fully on board leading up to Anglican changes. It wasn't that they didn't just come with us, it was that they actually became angry. And we're still puzzled today as to their reaction, and don't really understand why. Because they accept the teaching of the Catholic Church. They do not refute anything that's in the Catechism. But there's just something.
St. Thomas says that sin clouds the mind. And I'm afraid that in many cases in the UK, the great Anglo-Catholic shrine churches of London, and this applies to the United States as well, New York and Washington, D.C., are in some cases morally conflicted. In England, you can be a priest, in the Church of England, you can be a priest or a priestess in a relationship that is that of what do they call it now?
Irregular.
No, it's a lawful partnership. And it's not so. And one's not going to put up with that notion. One of the other problems in this country, and to a certain extent in ours, and certainly in England, is the habit of Americans and Canadians and Englishmen marrying more than once or twice or 3 times. The Diocese of Fort Worth, for example, they were planning to come in as a group, but it's for lapsed Catholics who have married again in the Episcopal Church without having their marriages annulled. And these are big problems. And anybody, we've all found that out, and some of us didn't know people have been married several times. But it happens and it has to be dealt with. You have to go to the local tribunal. And it's not as bad as people want divorce, but when you're told that your second marriage doesn't really count, when your first one did, people get upset. But they have to do it, and we found that the local tribunal in Victoria, for example, is very good. But those of them, there are moral problems connected with this. I wouldn't be surprised if at the Shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham in the UK, we are welcome there for sprinkling and the Holy Water, but we actually worship at the Slipper Chapel at the Catholic Shrine. We're not allowed to say Mass at the Anglican Shrine, but she is the patroness of the Ordinariate in England, and she's the principal patron of the Ordinariate in North America after St. Peter and the Church of St. Peter. So our principal church in Houston is Our Lady of Walsingham. And if you ever want to see a spectacular parish, it seems to be doing everything right. It also has tons of money. Our Lady of Walsingham is the place to go. It's a beautiful church. They started with practically nothing by 2001, and everything has just happened. They have homeschooling, they have a church with courts and fields, and the Chancellery office will be here. Yes?
We were in Houston in 1989. We were Anglican Catholic
Yes.
in Colorado, and we went to Our Lady of Walsingham. In 1989, it was a Catholic parish with Anglican rites.
Yeah.
I assume that was the same Our Lady of Walsingham
It is.
as we had now.
Pastoral provision parish.
Yes.
It was a Catholic
Yeah.
provision parish. Okay,
And that building is now gone.
right.
And they have a replica of the English parish church with the full people does. It is spectacular and growing place. I was there last presentation of the Lord last year, this year, and the 8 o'clock Mass was full, the 9:30 Mass was full, the 11 o'clock was overflowing. And 200 kids on Wednesday at the Reid Mass, all homeschoolers. And it's a good parish, and I'm so happy that it's our flagship. Yes?
They also have a wonderful online radio station as well.
Yes, they do. Yeah, they do. Yes.
One thing I could suggest in one general answer to the question why people with otherwise Catholic traditions don't convert. I was a convert to Anglicanism 30 years ago, and at least in my experience, I read that it's one thing to hold Catholic, it's one thing to hold Catholic positions as a matter of private belief or private judgment, but it's being in the English spirit. Resentment or reluctance to follow any arbitrary external authority. So, at least for me, on reflection, it's not only having to agree with the teachings of the church, but submitting to external authority in spiritual matters.
Yeah. That's hard for Englishmen, for Anglo-Saxons. And the other thing to remember is that Rome treats England differently than she does other parts of the world, because Canterbury and York are two provinces of the Catholic Church that got away. And don't forget that Canterbury came to be because Pope Gregory Reid knew what he wanted to do. He searched the archives. He knew one of the bishops, the bishoprics where he wanted London to be the primary see, New York the other see. He said he has to with detailed instructions. He kept in touch by letter. England had a relationship with the Holy See that was second to none. The first biographies of Gregory the Great came from Northern England. And it revived, it baptized Anglo-Saxon culture. St. Reid, who was a doctor of the church, his abbot made 7 trips to Rome, walking there and back, bringing back the arch-chanter of St. Peter's. It was a country very close to the Holy See. And then, of course, it wasn't by constitutional leading. But it will, it has to come back. And that's why Rome treats it differently. She wants it back, and it belongs with us. Yes?
I only hope you priests come over and have that delicious Apostolic Constitution. That's what I'm going to miss.
I can tell you, I've never been so happy in my life. And I think all of us who have become Catholic priests, the world comes at you. You know, you look out, I help out at the Cathedral of Victoria, and Father Michael, he says Mass for the Croatians. But everybody comes at you, and whether they're Filipinos or from South Asia or whatever, it is a marvelous experience. And to be able to sit in the confessional flowers is also a great blessing for the priest. And we're able to do that. In fact, I think the Cathedral of Victoria will have a hard job operating if it weren't for us. It has 2 priests at least that you can call on for help regularly. Another one of our priests was helping out the Portuguese parish. So he says something in English that in Portuguese. We all get all our friends.
We didn't have any serious overtures. It's just an issue of when you leave the Canterbury Communion, having believed in your own mind, of course, that it represented a valid branch of the church, the branch, so-called branch tree, you suddenly realize you are separated from the church. Which historic see do you seek to be reunited with? So as I say, it was a very temporary passing thought. We had no official conversations with the Orthodox. It was just in our own minds, which way do we turn? And very quickly it became obvious that, well, we were Latin Rite Catholics. It's logical for us to return to that mother ship. And of course, the ethnicity of the Orthodox is a whole different thing to overcome.
I think also there was a problem in Orthodoxy that one would have to be rebaptized. And the Catholic Church, of course, recognized our baptism. So it's just a no-brainer, I think, from that perspective alone.
But
great affection, but there's not official communion. So in Ottawa, my home parish was a small cathedral parish, and we rented space to the Romanian Orthodox, who had their Mass after our primary Mass on Sunday. And they would often invite me if their Archbishop was coming from Chicago or whatever, but I could not receive communion. Nor if they came to any of our services could they receive communion. So there was a great affinity, affection, but nothing official that way.
The OCA bishop, Archbishop in Canada, who had been formerly an Anglican, and whose sister for some time, well, I guess she went with him, but she belonged to an Anglican prayer group that she wanted to maintain a connection with because she had a lot of friends there. And he forbid her to pray with them.
And to finish that question, there were some members in our parish in Ottawa that, prior to discovering us as continuing Anglicans and having left the official Anglican community, went to Orthodoxy, and without exception, at some point were told, well, although you've been baptized now as an Orthodox and fully received, you can never be viewed as fully Orthodox because you weren't born Orthodox. And they were deadly serious in that observation, yes.
Kind of a boring question. So even if everybody in the community voted to become Catholic, what is the situation? They've got a church. They've got a church building potentially. What does ownership look like in the Anglican or Episcopal Church, and how does it affect the community joining Catholic?
And that differs. In our case, we all owned our own buildings, the parishes. In the continuing bodies, the dioceses did not own the building, so that was easy. If, however, a parish leaves the CUSA or the Anglican Church of Canada, it can be very sticky. So in the case of Calgary, St. John's Calgary, where Father Michael had been the priest when they were still Anglican Church of Canada, they are on a 5-year program to purchase the building from the Anglican Church of Canada. And they're now halfway through that. So it can be accomplished. Often, of course, it's not quite so happy. Yes?
We were in Denver in the 70s, and our whole parish voted to leave. But we owned the deed, but the courts determined that the diocese owned it, so we had to buy it back.
Yes.
So it went all the way to the Supreme Court.
And there are even stranger ones. One of our continuing Anglican parishes in Ontario was a Mohawk group of Anglicans. And their church was one of the 6 royal peculiars outside of England, which had been given to them by Queen Victoria. And they were still using communion vessels from the 19th century. But the Bishop of Ontario, which is headquartered in Kingston at the head of Lake Ontario, kicked us out and played bully, even though he had no claim to building. It was given by Queen Victoria to the Mohawks. So it's still bubbling through the Human Rights Commission now. We kind of stepped out of that and decided to let the natives deal with it themselves. Yes?
Are you married, and what's the
I am.
what's the future for married?
I can never be a bishop. Again.
Beyond that, in the future of the Ordinariate, is there a married priest?
Good question. There are 2 clauses that sort of contradict each other. The first one states that clerical celibacy will continue to be the norm. So when people meet me on the streets and I say I'm a Catholic priest, they say, but you're married. And I say, yes, I am. And my wife gives her funny language, I won't share it with you. And the common reaction is, well, it's about time. And I say, well, no, hang on a second. Clerical celibacy still is normal. But then in the accompanying document that goes along with it, it says that on a case-by-case basis, former Anglican clergy who are married may appeal to be ordained. And in England and Australia, that continues. But here in North America, our Episcopal delegates have taken a rather more rigid approach to the understanding of that, and they're trying to close it over. We're hoping that, of course, they'll realize that there is that provisional clause. Now, in the first wave, which is what we were called, any of us that were married had to have our rescripts signed by the Pope himself. Whereas Monsignor Wilkinson, who's not married, is just flying right through the CDF with no obstacles. So he could be ordained as a bishop because he's a celibate.
In that vein, does anybody understand how the OCA came to be overnight in the U.S.? I mean, is the rejection of married priests coming from there?
And not just the OCA, there's also an issue with Ukrainian Catholics and
Yeah.
it's-
The Orthodox Church in America was non-existent and became very large,
Yes.
essentially overnight.
I can't answer.
My first question is, according to that provision of Pope Benedict, you mentioned that anybody who would like to become Catholic and join the Anglican rites, wouldn't that be very easy for a person to say, well, I'd like to get married, and I'd like to become a priest, join the Anglican rites?
No, I mean, each of us had to submit a very comprehensive dossier of our entire life history up to this point, everything. And then there was a relatively rigorous formation program. It's not an easy thing. The Holy See is exercising appropriate scrutiny when it comes to any possible candidates for orders.
Will you send your men for seminary formation, or do you have vocation?
We do. Monsignor Steenson is a lecturer at St. Mary's Theological Seminary in Houston. So that is kind of our ground zero in North America for formation of candidates to priesthood. There was an accelerated program put together for those of us in the first wave. But we just had an ordination in Calgary 3 or 4 weeks ago. One of our former continuing Anglican priests who already had a doctorate in comparative religions, but he went to seminary in Wisconsin, to a Catholic seminary there, came back and was ordained, actually ordained a priest for the Catholic diocese, but with faculties in the Ordinariate. So there's a new twist again.
Well, after our talk here, there's some probably decaffeinated coffee in the back, and some sweets, and I believe the Schofields brought some plums. Thank you. The plums are very good because I might have grabbed one on my way to it. They're very good, thank you. We certainly thank our guests, and thank you for noting the Dominican help. I think we have something in common there to understand that each one of us offer something. Each one of the groups and orders in the church, each one of the members of the body of Christ offer something, and from our perspective, we know it's worth preserving a tradition, a spirituality, a rite. It's worth that, and it's worth it. It's important for the church. That's why we don't give up. I often get the question, why? What's the point? Everything I do, I have to answer this. Why Mass in Spanish? Why Dominican rite? Why Byzantine rite? Because it's important, because it speaks to Christ. So thank you. Thank you for your vocations and your story, your journey, and your witness to us. And thank you for being this guest and offering this Mass tomorrow. And to you, please come. Do come to the liturgy. This is just the first part. Come to the liturgy. And not just this one, but the events throughout August. We can worship, better understand how to worship the Lord. Yes.
Funny story to end with, recent scene. When we left CDF, having delivered the catechism, and being told by Father Gaston, who had another appointment in Barcelona, that he would be in touch. When we actually came out of CDF and walked down to the Swiss Guard, the gates opened, and Father de Noia was driving his car out of the gate. He stopped the car, got out, and came over and hugged each of us and said, "Thank you so much for coming." And I was amazed because I didn't know Dominicans could hug people. I thought they were just lions. And this very substantial man was hugging each of us. And it was wonderful, and Gustino has been a good friend of ours ever since.